The Hebrew Bible reading comes from Leviticus chapter 24, verses 18 through 20. Anyone who kills an animal shall make restitution for it, life for life. Anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return. Fracture for fracture, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered. Now, how many of you heard that before? Eye for an eye, right? Tooth for tooth, that's right. I want to say before we move on, because Jesus has something to say about eye for an eye, surprise, surprise, but it's not in a contemptuous way. When Jesus reflects back on eye for an eye, he is not saying that that was wrong. Contextually speaking, eye for an eye is a limiting factor. Before this, let me ask, how many of you seen The Godfather, that movie? How many of you have ever seen any kind of gangster stories or movies or anything like that, right? What happens in a gangster flick if somebody moves in on your territory and they take money from you? What do you do to that person? Retribution. Not just retribution, but what kind of retribution? Yeah, right. Somebody steals money from you and you kill them, right? You don't just try to get back exactly what they took from you, right? You try to kill them. And what happens when somebody kills somebody that's close to you? You want to kill them? Do you just go and kill one person? I'm going to tell you, if you're the mob, right? Not if you're somebody else. But if you're in the mob and somebody whacks one of your pals, it's like, okay, I'm not just going to kill that person. I'm going to go kill that person's entire family, right? I'm going to cut off a head of a horse and put it in their bed, right? Or whatever the mob justice is at the time. Now, what happens? You said you'd seen The Godfather. That's amazing. Anyway, so what happens if then somebody kills an entire family that you're close to, or maybe your entire family? Do you just go and kill their entire family? No, you level their entire village. Do you see how this kind of escalates, from one injustice or one harm to something much, much bigger, and how this never ends, a never-ending cycle of violence? Well, back in the day, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was actually a limiting factor, right? It stopped people from claiming too much retribution, right? It put a cap on what you were able to do. So now instead, if somebody steals your money, what do you get in return? That amount of money. If somebody punches you and puts your eye out, what's the maximum you can do? Put their eye out. Now, what we're going to see is not that is necessarily a good thing, right? But what we will also be able to recognize is that back in the day, this was actually a super important development for legal systems in the world, right? Because previously you just kind of did whatever you want until you felt that your revenge was satiated. But instead, now after the eye for an eye thing, we have a limit to the amount of violence. So again, it's not a requirement that you take somebody's eye. It's a limit, a maximum of what you can do to somebody else. Are we on board with that so far? All right? Because looking back, it's easy and it's tempting to see the Hebrew Bible as this ancient thing full of bad laws. It's not. You have to see how it moved the culture from where it was, and you have to see it in terms of a long moral arc. All right? So now, with that in mind, we're going to go and see what Jesus has to say about it. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 48. And we'll get to that in a second. Next slide, please. Before we keep going, I'm going to do this every time we start the Sermon on the Mount series, reminding us that all of the Sermon on the Mount is connected. So what we talk about today is definitely built on what happened before, what Jesus had taught before. It doesn't add more things to do. It is not adding more laws. Instead, everything that Jesus teaches is trying to get us to become better people, the kind of people for whom kingdom work comes naturally. The first thing that Jesus talks about is how to deal with your anger and contempt. If you're an angry person, if you don't ever deal healthily with your anger, it will affect everything that you do. And if you don't see people as people, but you see them with contempt, you see them as beneath you, then nothing else that Jesus teaches will ever matter. Those of you who are angry all the time, I'm talking to you. If you are angry all the time, that's the first thing you need to deal with, or you will never be the kind of person for whom kingdom life feels natural. Does that make sense? If you look at certain groups of people and you don't call them people, but you call them, I don't know, whatever, worms or jerks or aliens or hepcats, I don't know what you would call certain people without actually using those words like asshole. If your first thought is to call somebody an asshole, okay, you're doing it wrong. If your first thought when you think of certain groups of people is not they're a person loved by God, but rather they're an illegal, you're doing this wrong. If you think of people in terms of their political affiliation, Republicans or Democrats, you're doing this wrong. We are people first. Next, Jesus talks about objectification. If you have a desire for sex, you have a desire for somebody, you have a desire for something that somebody can do for you, and that's your first thought when interacting with somebody, instead of seeing them as a person, you are objectifying them. That's what Jesus talks about when he talks about lust. Lust isn't the problem. The objectification that causes lust is the problem. Next, Jesus talks about your yes being yes and your no being no, and being the kind of person that doesn't have to promise or swear or take an oath. Because if you are honest without manipulation all the time, nobody will need you to make promises. No one will need you to swear oaths. You will just be accepted as an honest person. And until you can get to the point where you don't need to swear or take oaths in order to be honest without manipulating somebody, then you do not feel comfortable in the kingdom of God. It doesn't come naturally to you. So building on all of those things, next slide, we're going to talk about something else. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to anyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. And this is the word of the Lord. Next slide. Old righteousness and new righteousness. Situation. Your will's being thwarted. The old righteousness says don't kill people. The new righteousness says deal with your anger and contempt. We just went through all of these. The next one we're going to talk about is what do you do when someone harms you, when someone actually gives you physical harm or threatens you in some actual way. I'm not talking about just being angry with you, talking about somebody has done something to you or is doing something to you. The old righteousness says, what? An eye for an eye. You do to them what they have done or are doing to you. I'm going to ask you, what do you think Jesus is going to say? Don't answer out loud. There will be a part to answer out loud later. But this is what we're going to be talking about. And I think it'll be a surprise here, because we've been taught a certain thing about this verse, this collection of verses, and I think you might be surprised by what Jesus is actually saying. So first thing I want to go back to the verse. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. Now, first off, I want to talk about this word resist. On the face of it, if somebody is doing evil, what does it seem like Jesus is saying?
Be passive.
Don't resist, right? Just let it happen. If somebody's beating the heck out of you, right, just let it happen. If somebody is abusing you, just let it happen. If somebody is stealing from you, just let it happen. Because that word resist is a very particular word in our vocabulary, is it not? You have probably been around Westside long enough to know that the words that people choose to interpret things as have a lot of baggage to them, right? If you are creating an empire in which laws are important and which authority is to be respected, words like don't resist become important. right? Have you seen the videos of police handling people and they say, don't resist, stop resisting. And in reality, the person's not actually resisting at all. They're just saying that, right? That's because there is a certain authority that needs to be respected in order for empires, in order for societies that are top down to have their way. If everybody resisted, what would happen? Chaos or something, right? The top-down nature of authority wouldn't be able to happen because the people who are under the authority have greater numbers and greater power than the people who have authority. Do you all understand that? Right? If all of a sudden everybody decided, no, we're not going to do that, what could the police or the military or the government do? Nothing. Right? Like there's just not a way to enforce on that level unless you have built it into their head that you should not resist. And for 1,500 years, has Christianity been on the side of governments and kings and empires saying, don't resist? Yes. We are complicit in building a populace that does not want to resist, that thinks it is wrong to resist. But is that what Jesus is saying? I think you already know what I'm going to say. It's not. Can you translate this Greek word resist? Sure. It can also be translated oppose, resist, or taking violent revenge. But the word itself, anthistemi, I'm not going to expect you to say it, anthistemi means to set yourself against someone. Do you understand what I'm saying? To set yourself against somebody else. If I have a problem, for example, with the way that our government is acting, is that the problem of one particular individual, or do I have a problem with the system itself? Can I oppose the system? Can I oppose the law? Can I oppose this particular policy without actually setting myself against the person? Do you understand exactly what I'm saying? Paul says something similar where he says, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and the principalities and the powers in the heavenly realms, right? In other words, we are fighting systems, we are fighting laws, we are fighting policies, not people, right? If a criminal comes up to you and wants to hurt you, if your first thought isn't, that is a child of God, then we're probably not going to handle the situation the way that Jesus would. Now, I haven't said the way that Jesus would handle it yet, so we're going to get to that. But what I am saying is everybody deserves to be treated as if they are a person who was created by God and loved by God. Everybody deserves love. Your battle, your struggle is not against an actual person, right? We are not setting ourselves against people. We are against certain actions. We are against ideas that are poor. We are against systems. That is a big difference. Now, what we talk about might seem like that distinction is minuscule, but it's not. And I think that you'll see that. Terry, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, if the system is personified as a person who's wearing a uniform, has a helmet, face mask on, and who's about to injure or kill me, can I treat that person as a child of God and not respond with protective forces? Am I called by this not to resist that person's effort to kill me?
The question was, if I am dealing with somebody who in their very nature is representing the system or the policy or the law that is hurting me and is about to hurt me, can I not resist, or can I not do something? Can I actively resist? Well, I'm glad that you asked, because that's the kind of thing we're going to talk about today. When Jesus says, for example, turn the other cheek, I would very much like a volunteer. Rachel, thank you very much. This is going to be awful for YouTube, but we'll make it happen.
I've done it the last last like 5 times you've done this.
So stand here for a second while I give some context. So how this is usually used, turn the other cheek, is to be passive, right? To do nothing, right? To simply cower and be battered. But that is not exactly what Jesus is saying. And you would know this because the context of where we are is different from the context of where Jesus and the people who were listening would have been there. The first century context, Rome in particular, was very hierarchical, right? And violence was primarily how you exerted your power over those who are under you. There were essentially 2 ways to hit a person, okay? There was the normal way, right, which in our society is fairly normal. You would do what? You would punch somebody. Another way would be, anybody want to guess? To slap a person. For those of you who are familiar with cultures that are more macho and manly, right? Which is more manly, being punched or being slapped? Right. And again, I'm not making any suggestions about rightness or wrongness of this, but if you were in a macho, masculine type culture, and some man walked up to another man and slapped him, how is that taken? Right? It would be better and less disrespectful to be punched. Are you on the same page as me, right? Like, slapping is what you do to...
I'm not saying it.
I'm not saying it.
Do you understand? But what I am saying is you do understand this context. You do understand what I'm saying. And yes, in macho, male-driven cultures, slaps are reserved for children and women. Okay? That is not what Jesus would do. I want to make that very clear, YouTube. That is not at all what Jesus is advocating. However, that is the kind of culture that Jesus found himself in. So, if I am interacting with a lesser, for example, if I'm a Roman or a Roman soldier or somebody in authority, and Rachel is one of Jesus' contemporaries, right, somebody who's a Hebrew, where does she fall in comparison to me on the social hierarchy?
Lesser.
Very low. Therefore, I can use force on her. However, if I'm going to use force on her, am I going to punch her or am I going to slap her? If I punch her, I'm essentially saying I'm treating you like a threat or like an equal. If I'm slapping her, it means I consider her beneath my notice and I just want her to go away. Are we on the same page? So if Rachel is facing me and Rachel has done something awful like exist and I don't like it, I would come up to Rachel and would I punch her right in the face? No, I would dismissively backhand her. Now, if I hit her hard enough, Rachel would go down. You don't have to go down. But she would, at this point, she is expected to do what? To cower, say sorry, hide, do something to say, I get it, you're the boss. Are you getting where this is going? But if instead, Rachel stands back up, stands her ground, and turns her face that way, what am I to do now? Am I to hit her again? Because now I'm going to just crush her right in the nose, and that's going to be awkward and weird, right? And also, if it didn't work the first time, why would it work the second time, right? So she turns her cheek this way, and that now forces me, if I'm going to hit her, what am I going to do? I'm going to punch her, right?
Like an equal.
I'm going to punch her, thank you, Rachel, which means I'm going to treat her like an equal. Now, you still may get beat down, right? But what happens when you have this person with authority, and they are allowed to go around and do that to slaves and people who are less than them, but what happens to everyone else when they see somebody who is not cowed by this? Let me ask you, who has the power in this situation? Right? It starts off with the person in power giving the backhand and expecting that person to cower. When that person does not cower, but simply stands back up and turns and says, okay, let's do this, right? The power now shifts. It's not because this person all of a sudden has the ability to do violence. It's shifted because they are now making a choice. They are resisting, right? But they are not attacking. They are resisting. They are not standing against. They are not cowering, right? They're not doing nothing. And yet they aren't doing violence either. In Jesus' day, there were two basic ways that the Hebrews thought of to deal with Rome. Rome was militarily superior. They just didn't have any ability to say, this is our army, it can go up against your army. So there were a group of people in Jerusalem, the Herodians and the Sadducees mainly, that said, given our situation, we should just accept Rome. We should just do nothing. We should just be chill and let whatever's going to happen, happen. And then there were Pharisees and Zealots who said, that's unacceptable, and even if we can't win, we're going to kill as many of them as possible. So do nothing or kill as many people as possible. It's into that context where Jesus comes in and says, what if there were more options besides allowing this to happen and killing a bunch of people? What's the problem with allowing it to happen? What's the problem with doing nothing? Traditionally, this is what we think of when we think of pacifists, isn't it? Right? Just people who roll over and accept it. What's the problem with this? Nothing changes. What else? It gives tacit approval to whatever's going on, right? You just put your head down and accept it. That's not kingdom of God stuff, is it? Does the kingdom of God move forward when people do nothing? No. On the other side. What's the problem when you say, hey, if somebody steps to me, I'm going to shank you? Or maybe I'll wait for you and I'll shank you in bed. Or maybe I'll just raise an army and we'll go up against you. What's the problem with this?
It's doing exactly what they did.
It's doing what they did. But what else? What have we learned in the first couple of chapters? Or in the first couple of series of the Sermon on the Mount? What has Jesus been talking about? Yeah, deal with your anger. That's one thing, right? Not seeing people with contempt, seeing them as people, right? We're going to get to a more fine point on this next time. But Jesus essentially says this: if you are looking at somebody and treating them like a child of God who is loved by God, stabbing them seems a little bit at cross purposes with loving people. Do you understand? Also, it doesn't work. How many revolutions have we seen that have been won by violence only to become the violent people that they fought to oppose? The way you win something is how you operate it and how you keep it. If you fight with violence, you will rule by violence. There is basically no exception that I know of. Because at the end of the day, violence is always an option for you. So Jesus says, what about a third way? What if I told you there is a way to stand up against the violence, stand up against the system without actually standing against the people? And this is the third way that Jesus talks about. If somebody hurts you, you don't hurt them back. But you don't let it go either. What does this mean for people who are in abusive relationships? The difference is your action changing the power dynamic? Ladies, if you are in an abusive, well, not just ladies, men, whoever, if you are in an abusive relationship and somebody hits you, can you take the power back by standing up to them and saying, that's not going to happen anymore, or you can keep hitting me all you want, but I will not cower to you? Can you do that? Yes. Is it right to do that? I don't know. Will it change the power dynamic in your relationship? If standing up to somebody and saying, this is not going to happen and you're not going to cower me, if that does change things, like, okay, great. It's still not cool to be hit, but if that happens, fine. But more often than not, is that what happens? More often than not, people are told, turn the other cheek, which means when he hits you, when she hits you, just take it. Accept it. Is that okay? Never. That is never okay. And I almost said something that would have veered me back into the anger and contempt area. I'm not immune to it either. But I kind of want to say, preachers who preach this message that women need to just stay in abusive relationships, this is the kind of thing that makes me feel anger and contempt. It kind of makes me wish that hell was real. I don't. And I love them in Jesus' name. But it kind of makes me feel that, and I have to work through it in a healthy way. Yes, Barbara?
That's called righteous anger, and you're entitled.
That's righteous anger, which spurs me to do good works. Yes. I don't want to treat those people with contempt, but let me just say that if you're listening to a preacher, or if you're a preacher yourself, you're telling women to stay in abusive relationships because Jesus said turn the other cheek, that is 1,000% heresy, and I hope you lose your minister's license. I don't know that. All right, I calm myself down. Right, so if it changes the power dynamic, right, then yes, you have the authority to do it. But if it's not changing anything and somebody is constantly hurting you and hitting you, staying is the worst thing you can do. That doesn't move the kingdom forward. It hurts you. It hurts the abuser. It hurts any children you have or anybody in your sphere of influence. Everybody's hurt by that, so it cannot be kingdom. The only time standing up and saying no is kingdom is when it puts the power back in the hands of the powerless. Do you want another example? I feel like you do want another example.
Yes.
Jesus says, if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. Now, this requires some context as well. How many pieces of clothing did typical Hebrews wear back in the day? 2. They had a cloak and a coat, right? One of them was an undergarment, coat or cloak. The other one was an overgarment. You've seen Jesus, right? Like Jesus wears the one garment and then he's got the overgarment on. You know. So somebody says, hey, buddy, you owe me money. Right? Maybe that person is just trying to get something out of you. Maybe they're trying to take advantage of you. Maybe they're right? Maybe you just can't afford it though, right? Jesus says, hey, give me your coat. If you are being challenged, if you're being hurt or oppressed by that kind of thing, now back in the day, what used to happen is Hebrews would get into debt, right? Powerful people would get them into debt and then they would just keep suing them over and over and over and over again till finally these people had nothing. Jesus says this, if somebody gets to the point where they say you owe them and they say that coat you're wearing is yours, is theirs. Jesus says this, when they take you to court, give your cloak as well. Now, what you don't know is that people didn't wear underwear back then. So if somebody took off their outer garment and then gave it to their accuser or to the person who's suing them, and then they said, oh, you must need this more than I do, and took off their cloak as well, that would leave them naked. Now, in Hebrew culture, being naked wasn't shameful. Seeing someone else naked was shameful. So picture this. We're in a courtroom, maybe something like this, or smaller than this, different shape, made of different materials. But imagine that you are all Hebrew, and this person says, they owe me this. They owe me this coat. And the person says, oh, no problem. Here, take the coat. And since you clearly need this more than I do, take my cloak as well. And they disrobe, and they are nude in the middle of all of these people. Who's embarrassed? Not the person who's naked. Everybody else is like, oh my gosh, what is happening? What have you brought down on our heads? Who were they? Who was the embarrassed party? The person who sues you and made you naked in front of everybody is now the person who caused all of this. They will be remembered. Do you remember when so-and-so sued that guy and made him naked? Ugh. Because it brought shame to everybody. Who has the power in that situation? The naked person. Isn't that funny? Right? Isn't that hilarious that like just by getting naked, you can make everybody embarrassed? Right? You have now taken the power back from them. Yeah. Jesus is not passive aggressive, right? Jesus is subversive, right? Jesus says, listen, if you are taking advantage of the laws, if you are taking advantage of your power, you don't just sit back and take it. You actually do direct action. You just don't use violence. You don't use force. You don't use coercion the way that they do. You absolutely have to act. You just have to be more creative about it. Do you want another example? I feel like you do. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile with them, go also the 2nd mile. So what's the context of this? Roman soldiers would roll into towns, right? Any town that wasn't Roman or didn't have Roman citizens, and anyone who was part of the empire but wasn't a Roman citizen could be forced to carry these heavy packs that the soldiers had to carry wherever they went. They did have donkeys, they did have other things, but most of the soldiers had to carry their own pack, and it was heavy. So when they rolled into a Jewish town, they probably got a bunch of, Jewish folk and said, "Hey, carry my pack." And Roman law says that you could force somebody to carry the pack for 1 mile. No more. Why was it important that you couldn't force them to go more than 1 mile? Mark? That's right. You would get in trouble. Right? So listen, we don't want to disrupt the daily lives of everybody that we've conquered because we need them to be about stuff. If we just got an entire village to follow us around everywhere, that would disrupt all of our taxes and all of the stuff that they needed to do in their village. So force them to go 1 mile, right? And if you force them to go more than 1 mile, you would get in trouble by your superior officer or whatever. So Jesus says this, oh yeah, when somebody asks you to take their pack, absolutely take it. And then don't stop. Can you imagine? Right? The soldier's walking, and then the Hebrew's walking behind with the pack, and the soldier goes, okay, that's the 1 mile mark, take it off, and the Hebrew just keeps walking. What does the soldier do? Hey, bud, hey, stop. Hey, stop that, man. I'm going to get in trouble if you keep going. Hey, stop. Bro, stop. Please stop. I'm begging you to stop. Can you imagine a Roman soldier begging a Hebrew person to please stop what they're doing? Who has the power? At any point, the Hebrew could just drop the pack and let it go. But the longer this goes on, the more precarious the soldier's place is. Do you understand that Jesus is not simply saying do nothing? Jesus is saying take an active interest in doing something. Take violence and harm and killing off the table and be creative. Do something. Take direct action. Protect human dignity at all costs. This is what Jesus meant when he said, do not resist them. Do not stand against people, because those people are also loved by God. Do you understand? That's a hard lesson, because so often we make people the symbols of what they serve. But that's not how God sees them. Imagine this. If you have a child, if you have a parent, if you have a brother or sister who is on the wrong team, whatever that means to you, is it important to you to redeem them? Is it important to you to find common ground? Is it important to you that no matter what they do, that they know that you're on their side somehow, that you could find common ground, that you can work for their redemption? Think about giving the kind of grace and understanding and desire for change to everyone that you would give to the people closest to you, and you are getting close to what Jesus was trying to say. Don't be against people. Be against bad stuff. It takes tremendous strength and courage and creativity to do the kind of things that Jesus is talking about. Part of the problem that we find ourselves in today's day and age is that we have given thousands and thousands of years to research and development on better ways to kill each other. How much, in terms of thousands of years, have we given to research and development on ways to solve problems without killing each other? And I believe that you will find that the technology trees are definitely unbalanced. So, starting right now, but what if somebody comes into my house and wants to kill me? What do I do? Like, I don't know. Like, figure it out. But like, maybe don't shoot first, right? Like, maybe at least give a conversation a try, right? Like, the problem is we're taking 2,000 of years of ignoring Jesus, right? And then trying to fix it all with what Jesus said 2,000 years ago. I don't know all of the answers. I do know that if it was your son or your daughter or your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister or your lover or your spouse who came in and pointed a gun at you, would you want to have a conversation first? Hell yeah! You wouldn't be like, they pointed a gun at me, I shot him. Do you understand the difference? You instinctively know how to love people that you love. Jesus just says, expand that. If you have somebody who is out of their mind and wants to shoot you, you may want to kill them first. That's a totally normal impulse, because we are survivalists at heart. But the minute you put that person's face with the face of somebody that you love, you try to think what? Something's wrong. How can I get us both out of this alive? You instinctively do that. Jesus is telling you, get instinctively like that with everyone. Don't stand against people. Stand against the bad stuff. If we do this, can things change? Next slide. Next slide. Stand up, not against. Stand up to people. Don't stand against them. Be creative. Be subversive. Next slide. Do you know who this is? Mahatma Gandhi. In India, when India was ruled by the British Empire, the British Empire controlled the Indian people through a number of means. They had the only ways to get food. They had the only ways to get clothing, right? So what did Gandhi do? Did he say, hey, you're oppressing my people, here's a bunch of swords? No. Here's a bunch of guns? No. He said, hey guys, let's all get together and go down to the ocean and get our own salt. Does that sound like a revolution?
No, it was.
It was. It doesn't sound like it, but if you know history, what does that mean? That means that when they did this illegal act of going to get their own salt, who is now not getting paid for salt? The British Empire, right? And the British companies, right? You've taken a revenue stream away from them. And notice what he's wearing. Notice what he's doing. He's making his own clothes. Gandhi and his folks made homespun clothing. Why? Because they just liked it better? It was more comfortable? Probably not. But because it takes away a little bit more power. Now you don't have to go to the empire or its subsidiaries for your clothing. You can do it yourself. You are disconnecting slowly and little by little from the people that are oppressing you. Was that revolutionary? Did he have to kill a single person? Did it work? Yes. India is no longer part of the British Empire. Why? Because Gandhi friggin' made his own clothes and has got his own salt. Yes, how ridiculous does that sound? But it works. Yeah.
Does the hunger strikes kind of tie into that?
Hunger strikes is the same thing. Yeah. Because it changes public opinion, right? By being so public and so good, right, to other people, and by saying, listen, the only people I want to suffer is me on behalf of somebody else. That's a power choice that you make. that he made, and it worked. Next slide. This person should look familiar. Who is it? Martin Luther King Jr. You know what Martin Luther King Jr. did? Is he shot a bunch of people. No, he didn't. Instead, what he did is say, hey, what if we all held hands and sang and walked? And when the cops said, hey, stop, what did they do? They didn't stop. Did they break laws? Yes. Did they hurt people? No. Did they get hurt? Yes. Did they change things? Yes. Do you see how this works? Gandhi said, hey, I'm paraphrasing here, but hey, I've been reading about this Jesus guy, and I think he might be onto something. Gandhi famously said, I might become a Christian if I had ever met one. Right? Because there was something about Jesus that made sense to him. Something about the non-violent direct action that Jesus, that Gandhi saw in Jesus that made sense to him. And Martin Luther King Jr. comes along and says, hey, look what Gandhi's doing. Oh my gosh, that's super Jesus. Like, let's do that too. Right? Next slide. Not a Christian, but 1989 in China in Tiananmen Square. Look at this guy. Could he do any violence to them if he wanted to? Is he about to get wrecked? Yes. But tell me who has the power. Tell me why these tanks have stopped. It's because one dude is like, hey, listen, I'm not going to kill anybody, but I'm going to stop these tanks. Even if it's just for a little bit, I'm going to do this thing. Can you imagine that guy? Can you imagine being that guy? It's insane. But this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. Stand against systems. Be subversive. Be creative. But don't kill people. It's just don't. Just love people instead. Now, am I saying that Christians should tell everybody to do this? Actually, no. I think Christians should never tell anybody to be like this. I think Christians should decide for themselves if this is something that they can do. Because remember, these are not new laws. Jesus is not giving more commandments. He is saying these are the kind of things that you can do, or that in Jesus' context you could do. Or maybe if you're in Tiananmen Square in 1989, maybe that's what you do. Maybe if you're in the civil rights movement marching with Martin Luther King Jr., maybe that's what you do. Maybe if you're under British control in India, maybe you join with Gandhi, maybe that's what you do. Jesus is saying be creative. Figure it out. But these aren't laws. Just be the kind of people who find a third way between doing nothing and being like the people who are oppressing you. Makes sense. And then we'll talk about why next time. I know how hard this stuff is, but I believe in you. You can do this. Amen?